listed by Fortune magazine as one of the 75 smartest books for teaching you everything you need to know about business. And that's a list that included Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and apparently one chapter from The General Theory by Keynes. So, fairly esteemed company to be holding. Reflecting his ability to straddle disciplines, Professor Varian holds academic appointments at the University of California, Berkeley in 3 departments: business, economics, and information management. He's also taught at MIT, Stanford, Oxford, Michigan, as well as a number of other universities. His expertise in the area of information technology has led to him landing what many economists would regard as the perfect job, namely the chief economist for Google, where he sits, in his own words, about 12 feet from perfect information, namely the Google CEO's office. Begs the question, why would an IT company hire a chief economist? One reason that I find fairly compelling is that Professor Varian designed the auctions that Google use to sell advertising space on their search results, and that's become Google's most important revenue source. Because of that example, other tech firms are increasingly looking at hiring chief economists. Professor Varian is no stranger to the University of Canterbury. He was previously here as an Erskine Scholar in 1984. On that occasion, shortly after he arrived, trading in the New Zealand dollar was suspended in the interregnum between the Muldoon and Lungi governments. The dollar was subsequently devalued and everything became very cheap for visiting Americans. And I'm delighted that as a mark of respect, we've again been able to engineer a 40% devaluation. Just in time for his visit. I had personally the pleasure of hearing Professor Varian speak last month when he was a keynote at AACSB Dean's meetings in the US. And so I'm particularly looking forward to tonight's lecture on evolutionary business, the effect of computer-mediated transactions. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hal Varian.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Christchurch at the University of Canterbury. I had a very, very pleasant stay here 25 years ago. It's hard to believe. But people have asked me, how is it that you got this job at Google being chief economist? I'll tell you the story. What happened was I was a dean at Berkeley, and maybe like deans here, if you stay out of trouble for 7 years, they give you time off for good behavior. And at the end of my term, I was thinking it might be fun to do something in the real world. And about that time, I ran into Eric Schmidt, who'd just become CEO of Google, and he said, "Why don't you come down to Google?" So I thought, well, I was thinking about doing something in the real world, but I'll go to Google instead. So it's been a lot of fun. When I went there were about 400 people, and now there are over 20,000. And along the way, I learned quite a bit about information technology and economics, and I do think that there's a huge contribution that economics can make to these areas. In fact, since I became chief economist at Google, they've appointed a chief economist at Yahoo and a chief economist at Microsoft. And about a month ago, I got a call from a major online company. I won't reveal who it was, but they said, well, Mr. Varian, we're thinking about hiring a chief economist. Tell me, what is it that you do exactly? So there's a lot of possibilities, as long as you don't go into too much detail. All right, so what I want to talk about is computer-mediated transactions. And that talk sort of divides into 3 parts. I want to talk about waves of innovation and a little snapshot of where we are now in this IT revolution. And then I want to talk about the real meat of the discussion, computer-mediated transactions. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about collaborative computing, because I think that's a very important area that we'll see increasing in the future. All right, so waves of innovation. So we've seen this phenomenal innovation on the web in the last 15 years. We've got web pages, search engines, wikis, online databases, all sorts of new innovations. And the question that you have to ask yourself, I think, is why has there been so much innovation, and why has it been so rapid? So my answer to those questions is what we've been seeing is an example of combinatorial innovation. And the idea is that every now and then you get a set of component parts, and I mean this in a very broad sense, component parts that can be combined and recombined to create new innovations. So back in the 1800s, the component parts were mechanical parts, the gears and wheels and pulleys and cams and all of these things that you use to build mechanical devices. Thomas Jefferson had taken a trip to France. He saw the French gunsmiths were so skilled that they could make parts for guns that could be interchanged from gun to gun, which was unheard of in those times. Came back to the United States and said we should develop this technology here. But since the U.S. had a huge shortage of skilled labor, all the people who had a skill stayed in Europe, of course, rather than emigrating. They wanted to be able to make these interchangeable parts by machine manufacture. So they set up the Springfield Armory, where it was one of the first R&D labs of the military. They worked on ways to create component parts that could be interchanged. And the same technology that was used to make guns in the early 1800s later was used to make the sewing machine, and later on the washing machine and the bicycle and all of these mechanical innovations that we saw arise during the 19th century. And then along comes 1900, where you had the component parts being the carriage, the bicycle, pneumatic tires, a gasoline engine. You put these together in the right way and you create an automobile. And so that set off a huge range of innovation as well. In the 1960s, we saw integrated circuits where you could create a component part that could be programmed to do all sorts of different things. If you look at it, George Moore of Moore's Law developed at Intel one of the first programmable chips, and one of his engineers said, you could use that chip to make a personal computer. And he thought, well, there's an idea, but what would you do with it? And so he spent the whole weekend trying to figure out what you could do with a personal computer, and the best idea he could come up with was that you could put recipes on it and put it in the kitchen, and then you could use it as an online recipe book. And that never actually happened. And he tells this story. This is a true story. He said, I just failed from lack of imagination. And indeed, once the personal computer was created, it took a while for people to figure out what good it was, what it was good for. But eventually, having that as a component part, and we'll see a little later in the talk, you could build the computer, you could build the integrated circuit into a whole range of devices. So now, in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen this huge explosion of innovation surrounding the Internet. If you compare it to these previous episodes, think about mechanical parts. That really took a century to figure out, to perfect the combination or recombination of mechanical parts. Because even though Jefferson came up with the idea in the late part of the 1700s, it really wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that people were able to perfect interchangeable parts. And same thing with gasoline engine, with integrated circuits. In many cases, it was decades to play out this combinatorial innovation. But here we've seen an incredibly rapid pace of development, really just a decade. And why is that? Well, the component parts are all bits this time. You've got protocols like TCP/IP, the underlying protocol for the Internet. You've got HTTP, the protocol for the web. You've got HTML, you've got CGI, you've got SQL. Got all these languages, HTML, XML, Java, Python, Perl, everything else. And so these bits and protocols and languages can be sent around the world in an instant, in a keystroke. And people can combine and recombine those components to create new innovations. The web pages, the internets, the chat rooms, the auctions, exchanges, video streaming, voice over IP, search engines. There's no time to manufacture. There's no delay. You never run out of HTML, just like you never run out of email. So there's no shortage. And you see this very rapid parallel innovation where people are creating new innovations using those component parts And you've seen this tremendous explosion of growth in Internet applications that we've all witnessed over the last few years. So the question I want to discuss this evening is really what the implications, or some of the implications are, of this innovation for commerce. Because this is, of course, a lecture to honor a great economist, and so I want to focus on the economic aspects of these technologies. So, here's an obvious point, completely obvious. A computer is now in the middle of almost every economic transaction. So almost every economic transaction that takes place, there's a computer in that exchange. So you go to the local store and you buy a candy bar or a cup of coffee, and what do you see? The cash register is used to ring up your purchase. And that cash register most likely is a PC. It's a component part. They just put a different interface on it. Instead of having that screen, a general purpose screen, it's got a screen that records transactions. It's got a computation inside that's tallying up the day's receipts, maybe checking it against inventory, doing all sorts of things. If you look at a web-based transaction, typically the computer that's in the middle connects to the database, so you could look not only at the characteristics of this transaction, the transaction that's occurring right now, but you could look up the history of transactions that might be involved between you or the buyer and the seller. So the original intent of putting the computer in the middle of all these transactions was just to keep track of things, just to do accounting, just like a regular cash register or a regular way of recording economic activity. But the record of transactions that are created now have a lot of other uses, not necessarily intended at the time this was created, but things that we can do now that we really couldn't do before, we could do only in a inadequate way before. So how does the presence of these computer-mediated transactions affect economic activity? That's really the theme of the talk this evening. So here's the outline. I want to run through these 5 different ways. You can enforce new contracts. You can better align incentives. You can enable data extraction and analysis. You can enable controlled experimentation. And you can enable personalization and customization. So those are the aspects that I want to discuss. And the first one, in many ways, I think is the most interesting because it goes to something very fundamental in economics, the idea of a contract. So what's a contract? Well, in its simplest form, it says, I will do X if you do Y. If you give me a cup of coffee, I'll give you $1. So that's a contract. Very, very simple contract in that case because it's a very simple exchange. So you can do exchanges of goods, services, labor, all sorts of things. Now the big problem in these contracts, as they get more complex, is you have to monitor the contract. I said, I'll do X if you do Y, but I need to verify that you're really fulfilling your part of the deal, and you may need to verify that I'm fulfilling my part of the deal. So did you really do X, and did you really do Y? So in many cases, the quality of the goods that are exchanged are not necessarily immediately verifiable. I may not know it's a good cup of coffee until I walk down the street and take a drink. Maybe that there are services where it's hard to verify the quality, or indeed whether the service has really been performed, or other action or efforts or many other things in these more complicated contracts aren't necessarily directly observable by the people that are engaging in the transaction. So where do the computers come in? Well, historically, we've seen various advances in technology that have enabled people to better monitor contracts. And as they're better able to monitor contracts, they can engage in more kinds of complicated exchanges. As they engage in more complicated exchanges, they can increase the total value of the exchanges that are done. So computers, the computerization of and putting a computer in the middle of every transaction has now allowed you to move this to an entirely new level. So I want to talk about this a little bit with some historical examples of how people use technology to monitor these transactions, and then we'll move into more recent times of how you can increase the capability of this monitoring by using the computers. So we'll start way back at the beginning. Here's an intermediate slide just that summarizes the argument. Since the computer serves as an intermediary, it can not only make a record of the transactions, but it can also verify this contractual performance, and that allows us to structure more elaborate contracts. So that's kind of a one-slide summary of what I said a minute ago. By the way, you might wonder who this person is on the left side of the page. That's Francesco De Marco Dattini, who's a famous accountant. Now, you probably didn't know there was such a thing as a famous accountant. But indeed, Mr. Dattini, also known as the Merchant of Prato, invented the letter of credit. So how'd you like to list that in your Vita? Invention, letter of credit. But you imagine what he could have done if he just had a computer, right? Because then he could do all sorts of interesting things, and that's what I want to talk about right now. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's look at how people monitored transactions in 3000 BC, and then move forward a few thousand years to look at how people monitored transactions in the 1880s, and we'll get right up to the 2000s. Okay, so let's look at Mediterranean shipping back in 3000 BC. You have this big problem. I'm loading barrels of olive oil onto the ship. The ship is going to sail off for several weeks to some other port. There they're going to pay me for the olive oil, and the money is going to make its way back. How do I verify that the product that I'm shipping is actually delivered? How do I make sure that what I say I'll do, I'll give you this olive oil in exchange for the money? How do we, both sides of the transaction, how do they ensure that performance is really carried out? And this is particularly difficult because this has to be done in a society that's pre-literate and pre-numerate. There's no writing, there's no arithmetic. So how do they do it? They had a very ingenious solution. They had little tokens shaped like barrels of olive oil. Those were called bullae, plural, or bulla, singular. Every time a barrel of olive oil was loaded onto the ship, a token was moved from one side of the counting desk to the other side of the counting desk. One barrel of olive oil, one token moved. After the barrels were loaded on, they took the tokens, put them inside a clay envelope, sealed the envelope, and then stamped the seal of the harbor master onto the clay, baked it in the oven, and loaded it onto the ship. This is sails off to the port. At the other end, they take the envelope out, they break it open under the inspection of the harbor master. Every time a barrel of olive oil is taken off the ship, a token is moved from the left-hand side of the table to the right-hand side of the table, and they verify that indeed there were just as many barrels taken off as were loaded on. So it's a very, very ingenious system, I think. Later on, they started inscribing as kind of a double check little marks on the outside of the envelope that would indicate how many bullae were contained inside, and many people believe it was those marks which led to writing. So the whole origin of writing in some way traces back, if you believe these archaeologists, traces back to this attempt to this form of accounting to verify that the economic transactions were carried out as they were intended to be. So zoom forward now. Oh, here's a picture. These are pictures of what the bullae looked like. They had different shaped tokens for each thing that was loaded on the ship. One shape for olive oil, one shape for wool, one shape for this and that. Zoom forward a few thousand years, and now we have a similar problem. How do you ensure that the amount of money that's put in the cash drawer actually stays in the cash drawer? So as businesses grew, and you started having people handling money who were outside the immediate family, you also had this problem of corruption. So the answer was to put a bell on the cash register. That's why when you pull the arm of the cash register, it goes ka-ching. That's so the owner of the store can hear the cash register has been open and maybe pay particular attention to what happens when the cash drawer is open. But then in 1883, James Riddy and John Birch got a patent on the incorruptible cashier. You can go look this patent up on the U.S. Patent Office. Actually, Google has an example of this patent. You can find these historical patents there. And he added an extra innovation, which put a paper tape in the cash register. So you had the paper tape that would then record every transactions. So indeed, you had a way of verifying that all these transactions actually took place, and in fact that the cash drawer had the appropriate amount of money in at the end of the day. What about a truck? Well, if you go out and look at the trucks, and I assume this is also true in New Zealand, virtually every large semi-truck has a computer in it. And the computer comprises something known as a vehicular monitoring system. And the vehicular monitoring system keeps track of how many miles are driven and how much gasoline is consumed and how much is loaded onto the truck and how much is taken off. In many cases, the trucks have a satellite link, so in fact they can update this information dynamically with the central database. So the whole system is now a distributed computing network that allows you to monitor the performance of all of those vehicles. And in fact, one of the things they discovered when they did this is that a rather common form of fraud was for the truck drivers to offer to fill up the tank of their buddies using the company credit card, and without being able to monitor all these transactions, you couldn't really detect this. And as soon as the vehicular monitoring systems went in place, they could find out that, gee, the mileage that this guy is showing on that particular leg of the trip seems off by an order of magnitude or so, and then they could, in fact, monitor these systems and make for better contracts. If you look at video store rentals, this is a very nice example from the early 1990s, mid-1990s. The original model for video store rentals was that the store purchased videos from the distributor. They purchased these and rented them out as many times as they could because they were very expensive to purchase. They cost $50 or $60 to buy a video back in those days. And then, of course, since they were quite expensive, you didn't want to buy too many of them. And the result was that when you went to the video store, they were always out of the video that you wanted to rent. So everybody was unhappy. The stores were unhappy because they couldn't rent out the new videos. The buyers or the renters were unhappy because they couldn't get what they want. The distributors were unhappy because they couldn't sell as many videos as people wanted to buy. And then somebody came up with a very clever idea. They said, instead of selling the videos to the store, let's give them to the store. And then we'll use a revenue sharing arrangement. So every time the video is rented out, $1 will go to the distributor. So that way, the stores now had as many videos as they wanted. Everybody was able to get the video they wanted when they went there, and you had a revenue share at the time each transaction took place. Now, the catch in such a plan is you have to have an honest accountant. You have to have somebody who keeps track of all the videos that are rented, so we make sure that I get my appropriate dollar every time that video goes out. Well, that's where the computer comes in, because those same cash registers, really PCs now, could be used in conjunction with a barcode scanning system and in conjunction with a network. So each day, at the end of the day, the record of all the transactions was sent back to the distributor, so the distributor could verify that indeed the transactions had taken place and that he was getting his appropriate payment for doing it. So it was very much along the same lines as James Ritty's incorruptible cashier, only now it was updated to the computer network with the barcodes. And you see, it would be very, very difficult to carry out this transaction, this contract that says you'll give me $1 every time the transaction takes place, unless you have a good way to monitor that the transactions are actually occurring. So another sort of similar example that's kind of nice, I think, is in the rental car industry these days. The rental car vendor has a incentive to make sure that you operate the car in a safe manner, because he pays insurance, and the insurance that he pays depends on experience rating. So the question is, you say, oh, yeah, I'm going to operate this car in a safe manner, and you sign the contract and go off and go speeding down the road. Well, now they're putting vehicular monitoring systems in rental cars. So if you go over the speed limit, then you have to pay a fine, not necessarily to the authorities, but to the rental car agency. So here's a case where there's a contract. It may be that I like the speed, but I'd rather go slow and pay a lower rate on my rental contract. Under current technology, or under the old technology, there was no way to verify whether I was actually operating the car safely. Now we have the capability of verifying this, so you can get an improved transaction for all parties. I have to sacrifice my desire to speed. On the other hand, I'm getting a break on the rental car rate. The car is getting lower insurance rate. The insurance company has lower payouts. And everybody's been made better off because now you can monitor a contract for performance that you couldn't monitor without that computer. Online advertising. This is another kind of nice one. So you think about it, there's a fundamental difference between what the publisher wants and what the advertiser wants. Because what the publisher has to sell is space on a page. In the lingo of the industry, there's a potential of putting an ad impression there. So that's what the publisher can do. They can provide an impression of an ad on that space. But what does the advertiser want? He doesn't necessarily care about impressions. What he wants is sales. Or at least he wants visitors to come to his website. So the advertiser cares about clicks, but the publisher can only sell impressions. So how do you align these two disparate needs? Well, you can think about the value per impression, which is the value per click times the clicks per impression. Value per click, VPC, times CTR. So if you're the intermediary, in this case Google or Yahoo or Microsoft, who's providing this capability of putting the ads on the publisher's page, if you can estimate the click-through rate, then you can easily convert the advertiser's value per click to the value per impression from the viewpoint of the publisher. So people are often confused about this when they look at these ad auctions that Google, Yahoo, and other major online advertising providers are doing. They ask, well, why are you charging per click? How can you get away with charging per click? Well, realistically, in reality, you're charging by the impression. Because what happens is you show the ad that has the highest bid per click times the probability that the probability that click is the probability that impression. I'm saying it wrong. You want the value per click times the clicks per impression. So you're looking at the expected number of clicks that the ad is going to get. So you could have an ad where somebody was really willing to pay a lot per click, but if it didn't get very many clicks, it wouldn't be worthwhile showing that particular ad. So what you're interested in this case, to align the incentives of the publisher and the advertiser, you need to be able to track the expected clicks that an ad is going to receive, and that's, of course, a huge statistical machine learning problem. In fact, if you look at these engines, they're amazing because for every ad, they're trying to forecast how likely that ad is going to receive a click in order to align the incentives of the publishers and the advertisers. And there's another kind of interesting aspect of this. There's also a revenue sharing arrangement that goes on at the time of the click. Because you could have a newspaper like the New York Times has an ad that's provided by Google. Advertiser is uploading the text of that ad to Google. Google is inserting that ad on the New York Times page. If a user clicks on the ad, there's a payment that the advertiser makes. That's the pay-per-click model. That payment is divided between the New York Times and Google at the time the click occurs. So you also have a revenue sharing arrangement occurring even in that context, and obviously there's no way that could be done without having the computer as the intermediary. So the purchase then that's made on the merchant's page, the advertiser's page, can be linked back to click, or linked back to an impression, which makes the advertising accountable. Because I can track how many clicks I'm getting with this ad or that ad, see which one is really performing well, and then use the ads that are performing best, or the publishers that are performing best, or the media outlet that's doing best for me. And that makes the advertising accountable in a way that it's never been before. So, there's the famous marketeer's lament, where he says, half of my advertising budget is wasted, I just don't know which half. Well, with this computer-based advertising, you'll actually track back and see which half is wasted. See which ads are really performing well and which ads are performing poorly. So obviously the paradigm example of this is the search-based advertising, where you're showing people ads that are based on the actual search they're conducting at that moment. You're showing somebody an ad which is highly relevant to their interest. Why do you know it's relevant to their interest? Because it's based on the text that they're searching for. So little further extended notion of this is to show somebody an ad that's contextually related to the contents that they're reading at the moment. So you may be reading a story about a wonderful vacation spot in Hawaii, and the ads that's shown would be cheap fares to Hawaii, hotel accommodations in Hawaii, all sorts of things that tie into the context of that ad. Same thing with mobile advertising. You're using your smartphone, you're keying in a query about a restaurant. Well, the phone knows the restaurant's in the current location and can show you ads based on not only your interest, as indicated by the query you've entered into the cell phone, but actually your location, since it's also aware of where you are at the moment. And the same thing with TV, radio, print, etc. You can make advertising accountable in a way that really hasn't been accountable previously. And in fact, those records of transactions allow you to optimize the buying process from ad to sale. So not only can you measure the advertising effectiveness, the way I was just describing, you can also debug the purchasing process. So if you look at an online vendor like Amazon, they study the clickstream, the movement of the purchaser through the site very, very carefully and try to find out where it is that people are dropping out. They don't finish the transaction here because this page is confusing what to click next. So you can optimize and streamline those processes in a way that just hasn't been possible before. And you can also estimate useful marketing relationships. So for example, if you use any of these online vendors, you'll see people who bought this also bought that, or you may consider this purchase because you purchased things like it in the past, and so you can make recommendations to people that are much more actionable than you could make without this online capability. So you can set up kind of an assembly line for marketing, which you can fine-tune on a piece-by-piece basis, optimizing this part of the transaction process, optimizing this part, and so on. So if you look at the assembly line, I had pulled out a couple pictures here. The Venetians back in the 14th century optimized the construction of galleys because it was too expensive to maintain a standing navy. It was just nice to build a navy whenever you needed it. So they figured out how to turn out galleys, one galley a day, which was a remarkable achievement for the time. And if you look at Henry Ford in 1909, optimizing the assembly line for manufacture of automobiles. In fact, there's kind of an interesting aside there. The legend has it, I don't know if this has ever been proved, but the claim is that Ford came up with the idea of the assembly line after touring a meat packing plant in Chicago. And the way the meat packing plant worked is they hung up the carcass on a hook, and one butcher carved off the steaks and moved the carcass down, another one carved off the chops, and another one carved off the ribs. And he thought, gee, if they can carve that meat going this way, you should be assembling a cow going the other direction, right? So they had a disassembly line, and he said, let's make it an assembly line and put the cow back together. Well, it didn't work for cows, but of course it did work for cars. So there's a couple pictures of the gondolas or the war galleys and the assembly line back in 20th century Michigan. Okay, so another thing you can do, in addition to this contractual optimization and alignment of incentives that I've just been talking about, is you can do this kind of data extraction and analysis. So since the online transactions are computer mediated, you can study the data for patterns. So for example, if you think of this keyword search engine advertising that I was just describing, advertisers bid for keywords. Which keyword do you suppose is more valuable? Diamond or diamonds? Which keyword do you think is more valuable? So it turns out that diamonds are more valuable than diamond, because if your kid is doing a homework project on forms of carbon, he types in a query diamond. But if you're going out and buying a present for your wife, you type in diamonds. Right? So diamonds turns out to be worth 20 or 30% more than diamond, and that's determined by the competitive market. How do clicks vary over time of day? Now this is kind of interesting. Do you suppose most clicks are in the evening when you're at home, not working? Or do you suppose most clicks occur during the day when you're on the job? Yes, right, of course. Most peak time for ad clicks is around 11 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, morning tea time, exactly. And then what advertiser characteristics predict success? So you have advertisers who are coming on and trying this, and some people are really getting into it and spending a lot of money and optimizing their campaigns and doing all sorts of other stuff. Other people are just doing it as a sideline, so you can look at the kinds of interactions that advertisers have with the system and predict which ones seem to be getting the most value out of it. So you can build predictive and causal models using standard econometric and statistical tools, formulate hypotheses, examine the data, see if you can figure out what seems to work and what doesn't. But the nice thing, unlike econometrics, is you don't have to just examine the data ex post, but you actually intervene and you do experiments. And that's one of the beautiful things about having this capability of dealing with online transactions, because the data from those computer-mediated transactions allow you not only to measure phenomenon and to detect patterns, but you can actually do controlled experiments. So you can do treatment, control, and once you formulate a hypothesis about what might improve the effectiveness of a particular ad or the behavior of a particular advertiser, what you can do is you can carry out an experiment and theory really works. So one of the critical reasons for Google's success is this experimentation and continuous improvement that goes on. They've built systems that allow you to do very elaborate controlled experiments, tweaking different parts of the system, and then focus in on which treatments are performing best and discover what works and what doesn't work in literally a few days. So experimentation should be available in every web environment, and too often it's added in as an afterthought. If you're building a website, you should make absolutely sure that on your website you can try out different designs. You can try out different treatments. Because little things like changing the font or changing the color or making one thing large and another thing small or moving where a box is in the page can have huge returns. In fact, several months ago, Google experimented with the background color for ads. You know, there are ads at the top of the page, and people were saying, what color works best there? Well, you don't have to speculate on it. You can just try out the colors and rotate different colors in and out. And after a few days of experimentation, they figured out the answer. Turns out it's yellow. Yellow's the part that really stands out, makes the ads be more apparent, increases the click-through rate, and of course increases the revenue for the advertiser. So when you come right down to it, when you're making these decisions in business, there's really only two ways to do it. You can use data, or you can use hippos. What's a hippo? Hippo is a highly paid person's opinion. And what happens way, way too much is that people sit around the conference table and debate, I think the best color is blue, and somebody else says, I think the best color is green. Well, you don't want to use expensive managerial time to hold those sorts of debates. What you want the managers to do is to say, well, what kind of experiment can we run to figure out what the best thing to do is? And the great thing about the online environment is you can do this experimentation far, far more inexpensively than you could do it in the past for other kinds of retailing environments. So it becomes much, much simpler to do experimentation, to figure out what works. You can do this in a much more rapid way than you could ever do before. Customization and personalization. So the computer-mediated transactions allow for a mass customization in which transactions can be optimized for individual behavior. So, of course, if you go to Amazon, you'll see a web page. This web page is designed for you. It's designed for you because it's based on your history of transactions. And you'll see recommendations that are designed for you. And maybe they'll use information about other people. People who bought this good also bought that good, or people who like this book also like that book. But it's also the case that the optimizations performed are based on your particular history of transactions. And if you look at searches on Google, it can be done in exactly the same way. You're seeing searches that are you're seeing ads that are based on your query, on the query that you typed in. What could be more personalized or customized than that? Now, of course, when you're able to customize the environment for each individual, you do run into issues involving privacy. And that's one of the big challenges, I think, that we face in the online environment. You want to have consent of the individuals in terms of, yes, I agree that I would like to see ads that are relevant to my interests, and here's what my interests are. So you have to trade off this benefits from personalization of seeing things that are relevant to you to the potential costs, where you may see, I think it's creepy seeing ads that are relevant to me. So the primary issues, I think, are trust and security, because after all, I share information with my doctor, and my lawyer, and my accountant, and all these other parties, a lot of personal information. But I'm doing so because by sharing that information, I get an improved service. And it's really no different than doing that with an online vendor. By sharing that information with the online vendor, you're potentially getting improvements in the quality of service, and for many people, I think that would be a very acceptable trade-off. In fact, when you think about it, very, very little of the concerns about online privacy have to do with the intended use of the data. Because the intended use of the data about, say, your browsing habits is to show you more relevant ads and more relevant content. That's why the sellers are capturing that information. So who could complain about that? It's not the intended uses that really bother people, it's the unintended uses. They're worried about this information falling into the wrong hands or being misused in some way. But I would argue that's not really a privacy issue, that's a security issue. Is the information appropriately safeguarded and appropriately used? So advertising is really just the beginning. In this talk, I've focused on advertising. The computer-mediated transactions make advertising accountable, but they can also lead to many other kinds of optimization. So go back to the trucks. The big improvement in trucking was not just, in that case, making the drivers accountable, but was improving the logistics of being able to ship goods more efficiently around the country. And you can use the computer-mediated transactions to get customer feedback, because when you've got a computer in the middle of the transaction, the customer can tell you, oh, that transaction went very well, or I like this product, or I dislike this product, or I wish the product had this feature, so you can improve the product design. And you can evolve the product in a way that better satisfies consumers' needs. You can build these kinds of recommender systems that I was describing earlier with Amazon, where many cases in today's society, we're so wealthy, we have such a huge number of choices, that the problem is figuring out which of these many products is the one that's going to most suit my needs. So having recommender systems or ways to advise people on purchases can be extremely valuable. So in many cases, you can improve these business processes across the board by having the computers in the middle of these transactions. So if you go back to this historical perspective, I was referring earlier to Henry Ford and the assembly line in the early parts of this century, where they were constantly experimenting with the assembly line because they were trying to optimize the flow of product through the factory in the early 1900s. But now if you think about computers, we're trying to optimize the flow of ideas through the organization. And the question is, how can we use not just these commercial transactions between buyers and sellers, but the transactions between workers can be optimized by improving the flow of information from one member of a team to another member of a team. So you can do the same kind of separation, distribution, and optimization of tasks for knowledge work that we did for this mechanical work a century ago. So you think about a very common thing that you do now is multi-authored documents. So you create a document and you send it to your co-author, your colleagues, and your colleagues add something to it or subtract something to it. You've got this document bouncing back and forth. It's very hard to keep track of the version. It's very hard to keep track of all the revisions that are made, et cetera, et cetera. You'd like to optimize that flow of knowledge work, and one way you can do it is you can use cloud computing, or computing where there's a single copy of to the document sitting up there. Everybody can access that single copy, and you can mutually author a document without having to go through all of this tedious version tracking and control. So you can overcome the barriers of distance. This isn't just necessarily working with a person in the next office. You could be working with a person on the other side of the globe. In fact, I'll tell you a nice story I heard from some friends of mine at a consulting company. I said, boy, you guys have beautiful PowerPoint. How do you do that? He says, well, we have the same crappy PowerPoint as everybody else, but every evening when we're done work, we send it off to India, and they clean it all up and make it beautiful. And the next morning it comes back, it looks great. So here you have this 24-hour production cycle where people are working on creating the ideas and improving the presentation ideas really around the clock. You're able to do this because you can do this kind of collaborative knowledge work. So I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes. Here's a little picture. I love this picture. It's a great example of productivity enhancements for knowledge work. In fact, it's kind of an early form of hypertext. As you see, what you've got there is a big wheel with books, and you can hyperlink from one book to another. So you come across a word, and you spin the wheel, and you find its definition, and here you find another word, and you go back and forth. It's kind of a really beautiful example of somebody who had a vision of how to do these multi-author documents and hyperlinked documents, but didn't really have the technology to carry it out. All right, so all of this is enabled by cloud computing. And if you think about it, cloud computing is kind of the latest step in how computing is developed. 30 years ago, we had mainframes. The data set in one place, but access was controlled. The computer sat in an air-conditioned room, people wearing white coats fed cards into it. And then from that, we moved to network workstations where the data was distributed across the network, but at least the access was open. And then we got to the stage of personal computing where you had open access, where the data primarily sat on a single computer in LAN. And the latest phase of this evolution is what we call cloud computing, where there's open access. The data sits in one place with backups potentially distributed in multiple geographic locations. You can store it once and read it everywhere. Access it from any device. I can access the same document from my personal computer, from your personal computer, from my cell phone, from my Kindle, from all sorts of other devices. Why? Because there's this one master copy that's available to everybody who has access to that document. And so what that means is you can maintain the information better, and you can facilitate the teamwork or the group activities which improve the quality of that document, just like people use groups more effectively to manufacture devices 100 years ago. We can now use groups more effectively to create information in today's economy. So in fact, the barriers to entry for online businesses are falling very, very rapidly. You can purchase space in a data center, storage on demand, development environments from Google, Amazon, many other places. You've taken what was formerly a fixed cost, the cost of assembling the infrastructure to create your product, has now become a variable cost because you can expand your usage of data center or storage or network capabilities on demand. And what does that mean when you're able to scale your business to meet customer demand? It allows this combinatorial innovation I was talking about to be pushed to a whole new level because you removed a fixed cost of doing business and you're allowing for this parallel evolution by making all of your costs essentially variable costs. And my view is this will foster a huge burst of creative activity. And as a little example of this, before on a slide I had the phrase micro multinationals. So I first discovered this phenomenon from talking to a friend of mine. I said, what are you doing these days? He says, oh, I've got a business. I says, well, where is your business? He says, well, I've got 2 people in San Francisco, 3 people in Italy, 2 people in Spain, and a couple guys in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic. And I said, that's amazing. And he says, yeah, we just all communicate via email. And nowadays, if you think about it, the smallest company has access to communications technology that only the big multinationals could afford a few years ago. So you've got email and web pages and wikis and voice over IP and wireless computing, collaborative computing, cloud computing, all of these examples. So you can spread a business literally around the world, not just the big businesses, but even a very small business. So again, this fosters the kind of combinatorial innovation I was discussing earlier, because you can combine talent not just by getting it in one location, but by utilizing talent wherever it can be found. So businesses can be born international. You don't have to start out in one place, grow, and then become international. You could be international from day one because the communications technology is so inexpensive and so ubiquitous these days. So that gives you a huge parallel innovation in technology and commerce, and I believe we're really just at the beginning of that phase. So maybe that's a good place to stop the talk. I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take questions, and I'm going to try to be good and repeat the question because so the people can hear it on the recording. Questions? Yes.
You gave the example of video stores where with the better accounting technology here, you could have new revenue sharing agreements that was an improvement for all concerned. What I was wondering is, every time there's an improvement in technology that enables new contracts, isn't there still the same incentive for some people to try and get around the new technology? So would there still be an incentive for video stores to try and have one set of accounts with potential distributors and another that's the actual one? Doesn't that get in the way of the optimism of the new contracts that we're doing?
So the question was about the video store example. Here I said you had the computer that monitored these transactions, but wasn't there still ways to get around that new monitoring technology? It didn't solve all the problems. And of course, I completely agree. Fraud will always be with this. People are always going to try to figure out ways to get around some of these monitoring devices. So one thing that mitigates that particular problem is you can compare the performance of video rental stores across the stores. So if you saw in one case this particular movie that was just doing great in every store but was not doing so well in this one particular store, you could try to investigate why that might be happening. And the same thing with the trucks. When you look at the truck monitoring systems, they were also comparing the performance across drivers. And, you know, it's 99% of the people are honest, 99% of the time is the 1% that kills you. But you can find that 1% sometimes by looking for statistical clues. And if you're looking, for example, at the online advertising, there's a phenomenon known as click fraud, where when the publisher gets a revenue share every time somebody clicks on your ad, well, there's kind of a temptation to click on ads on your publisher's site. And so there's a lot of effort goes into monitoring the pattern of clicks and detecting the people that are engaging in this kind of fraudulent activity. So it's just like credit cards, credit card fraud is the same thing. There's statistical patterns you can look out for. You don't eliminate fraud, but at least you're allowing for a higher level or more transactions you could have than if this were a huge concern. Other questions? Yes?
I notice when I search on Google sometimes that the top link that comes up is the same as one of the sponsor links.
Yep.
How do you in fact get revenue out of that if people simply don't go to the sponsor link, they go to the top link?
Right. So the question there was, when you search on Google, sometimes the first search result will be the same as the first ad. And so if you search particular for a brand name or something like that, you'll see an ad in the search result that will be pretty much for the same thing. And what happens there is, of course, it's up to the advertiser whether or not they want to purchase their own brand name. But in many cases, they'll want to do it as a defensive measure because they will want to ensure that when you search for my product, you see my ad and my product rather than my product and somebody else's ad, right? Because it could distract the buyer from what they're originally looking for. So, I mean, to use a kind of silly example, But if you're searching for Coke, maybe the first search result will be Coke and the first ad will be Coke, but Coke's much happier with that than having the first search result being Coke and the first ad being Pepsi. So, yes? So the question is, we have e-commerce, but has any thinking gone into the idea of having an e-economy? And I think it's kind of a natural evolution of the forces that I was describing, because remember I started out talking about transactions, but then ended up talking about the organization of business. And the same kinds of technology that you're using to make these transactions between parties work more effectively is going to allow you to improve the operations within businesses, and for that matter within households, and so you can get a much more optimized flow of production and consumption that you could without having that capability. Yes?
Yeah. I want to ask you about personalization and customization in my mind. I think first of all the terms are often used pretty interchangeably and very loosely, but it seems to me that what we've got is a great deal of customization around past purchases of your records, but almost nothing on personalization based on preferences. So, for example, my screen looks exactly the same as everybody else's screen in terms of layout. Do you see any research going on or any efforts made to actually start personalizing the approaches of the individual preferences?
So the question was to distinguish between personalization and customization, where the idea is typically now the screen that I see is very similar to the screen that you see, and it's not necessarily optimized for my own needs. Well, there is research going on in this area because, for example, people have different cognitive styles. Some people more visually oriented, some people more data oriented. And there's work that's going on to try to display information in the form that's most accessible to the particular user. And that includes commercial information and other kinds of information. So right now I would say this is still a research topic. It's not something that's found its way into mainstream activity. But I think that we will see that coming up in the next several years. Yes?
Does Google have artificial intelligence?
Well, one of the question was, does Google have artificial intelligence? And I will say one of the concerns at Google is we're worried that someday the system will come alive, kind of like Skynet. But we've made a deal with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California. So he's promised to intervene if this occurs. So we feel a lot safer now. Yes?
It sounds as if your role with Google started off very nicely in a cozy experimentation fashion. So why do you believe Google still has a chief economist?
Well, the question is, I started out working on just a few things on the ad auction, and then that's pretty much matured now, so why is it that Google still has a chief economist? Well, you know, we've had recessions and other things, so it's kind of handy to have an economist around to read tea leaves and that kind of thing. So, in fact, given the time I've spent at Google, I guess 7 years now, it really is amazing how many aspects of economics, how useful economics could be in business. I mean, whether it's using statistical methods or whether it's using simple models or whether it's interpreting what's going on in the outside economy. Right now, in fact, we have a group of about 30 people. So it's not just me. We have a group of statisticians, econometricians, operations research people, lots of people who are constantly looking at the data that's driving the company and trying to interpret how to improve the performance of different aspects of the company's operation. So because Google is driven by information technology, and we have this huge resources of data, people that are able to analyze that data and extract actions out of that analysis are critically important to companies' prospects. So it's not just Google. I mean, Google may be at the forefront of this, but every company is going to be in the same situation in the future. Yes?
You paint a very optimistic picture of the well-being computing technology to monitor what's going on. How come no regulators spotted the credit crunch coming?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
How come no regulators spotted the credit crunch coming?
Okay, so the question is, I paint a very optimistic picture of how computers can monitor these transactions, but how come is it that regulators didn't see the credit crunch coming on? Well, I would say that, of course, it's people that interpret the data. So the data could be presented to people, and we may draw different conclusions from it. But there were regulators who saw the credit crunch coming on. I had Ned Gramlich, who was a governor of the Federal Reserve System, saw the deterioration in credit conditions and lobbied for improvement and more regulation in that area. So there were some voices in the wilderness. I don't think it was necessary that the computers weren't giving the right information. It was in many cases people didn't want to hear what they were saying. So it was more of an incentive problem than a data problem per se. Yes?
Well, I have a similar question. The question has to do with potential parallels between kind of financial markets now and the situation in the internet and computer research as well. So you've got a great deal of interlocking resources. You've got firms that are financially heavily leveraged, and we've seen these effects can tend to have negative feedback. They present themselves in financial markets. Do you see any parallels to the kind of world we're describing here with information? In a sense, we see great degrees of information diversification, and we're more heavily leveraged in terms of information. Is there the same potential for these kind of negative feedback things to arise in the market?
Okay, so the question was, is there a parallel between the kinds of information technology interactions that I was discussing and the kind of financial meltdowns that we've seen recently? One thing I should point out is if you look at most technology businesses, the Apples, the Googles, the Yahoos, the Oracles, etc., they've got the opposite of leverage. They have these huge cash reserves, Microsoft being, of course, another example, because in many cases when the business is successful, it builds up the funding more quickly than it can find profitable investments to pursue. So the technology sector as a whole is quite stable from the financial point of view. I have talked about the quants moving from Wall Street to Madison Avenue. In fact, I started talking about that a couple of years ago, and everybody just laughed because they said, "Oh, who would bother? If you were able to do this data-intensive quantitative analysis that has this very high reward on Wall Street, why would you bother to use those same techniques in marketing?" But I think now they aren't laughing quite as much because there aren't as many jobs on Wall Street as there used to be. And the quants are moving into doing this kind of analytic marketing that I was describing a few minutes ago, because the same kind of patterns of behavior and very rich data environments that were there in the financial world are now available in the marketing world, and that means you could do a much more scientific study of marketing than you could do in the past. So I don't think it has the potential for the same kind of meltdown, mostly because a lot of the problems we saw in the financial world were due to excess leverage. And I don't really see the possibility of having that kind of excessive leverage in this environment. But maybe I'm naive. There always are ways to... history may prove me wrong on that. Yes?
I just have a quick follow-up to the gentleman's question about personalization and customization. And he mentioned, as you mentioned earlier, about personalization being typically based on user history.
Yep.
I work with a company called Vertex DNA that has a realm of personalization based on complex systems of mathematics. And I'm just wondering if you are familiar with models such as the one at Vertex DNA that aren't based on user history, that are in fact forward-looking as opposed to you bought this chainsaw, therefore you might be likely to want this place.
Okay, so the question was, if you look at the kinds of personalization and customization that we were talking about, I was looking at cases where it was mostly based on history of interaction, but there may be better ways to do it that involve looking at and kind of forward-looking information, and that may well be. I mean, I know we experiment. We have a lot of user studies where we try to figure out what users react best to, and certainly I think there's going to be advances in this area. The history is maybe the easiest one to understand and the most familiar to people, but I certainly wouldn't rule out that there'd be other ways to do this kind of personalization and customization. I guess I'll take one more. Yeah.
Google's developed this whole empire on the world of free, and so free with searching, extended to Gmail, free with even to documents. There's even rumours of a Google Drive which will completely revolutionise the way we have hard drives at home. So this free economic model, this free economics of vertical reform, how far do you think that's going to extend? Do you think it's going to just be confined to the internet, or it will start appearing in our real life?
Well, so the question had to do with free. Google's developed a business model where many, many services are offered for free. And by the way, it isn't just Google, but there are a wealth of free services available on the web. Free information is available on the web. And so the question is, how far will this go? Could you imagine that spilling over into real life? Well, if you look, we're so phenomenally prosperous now compared to what people were like 100 or 200 years ago, and we have many, many free things that we just take for granted. I do think that in some aspects of the information economy, you do see something of a backlash for free, because free is often supported by advertising. And if you look at TV these days, people are paying quite a bit to avoid advertising, whether it's buying your cable TV with being able to skip through commercials, or whether it's using DVDs or pay-per-view or all sorts of other things, that the pendulum in some sense has moved away from free plus advertising to, well, I'll pay a little bit to avoid interruptions. So I think there's some natural limits on how far free can go. I don't think we've reached them yet online, because online the advertising is generally very, very unobtrusive and not particularly annoying, at least the kind of search advertising that I was discussing earlier. So we haven't reached that limit yet, but I do think there is a limit to how far the free economy can develop. So maybe that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much.